The sun hung low over the dusty plains, casting long shadows across the quiet ranch. Daniel Hayes leaned against the wooden fence, his eyes scanning the horizon the way they always did at the end of the day. Out here, silence wasn't peaceful, it was heavy. It reminded him of everything he had lost. 5 years had passed since his wife and son were taken by fever, but the emptiness hadn't faded. It had settled into the walls of his cabin, into the creak of the floorboards, into the long nights that never seemed to end. He had learned to live with it the only way he knew how, by working, by keeping his hands busy and his thoughts quiet. The cattle needed tending, the fences needed fixing, the land demanded attention, and so he gave it everything because it was easier than remembering. That evening, as he turned to head back toward the barn, something caught his eye near the edge of the property. At first he thought it was just a shadow moving between the brush, but then it moved again, small, cautious. He narrowed his eyes and stepped forward slowly. "Hello?" he called out, his voice steady but alert. No answer. The wind carried only the rustle of dry grass. He moved closer, careful not to startle whatever or whoever was there. And then he saw her. A small girl, no older than 8 or 9, standing half hidden behind a cluster of low bushes. Her clothes were worn, her dark hair tangled, and her face was guarded in a way no child should be. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She just watched him, her eyes sharp and wary, like she had already learned the world wasn't kind. Daniel stopped a few feet away, raising his hand slightly to show he meant no harm. "You lost?" he asked gently. She didn't answer. Her gaze flicked toward the open land behind her, then back to him. "You out here alone?" he tried again. A small pause. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "Yes." Her voice was quiet, but there was strength in it. Daniel felt something shift in his chest. He had seen fear before, but this wasn't fear. This was survival. He crouched slightly to be closer to her level. "Where's your family?" he asked. She hesitated, then shook her head once. "Gone." The word was simple, but it carried weight. Daniel didn't press further. He knew that kind of answer. He had lived it. He glanced toward the horizon again. No sign of anyone. No horses, no smoke, no movement. She hadn't just wandered here, she had nowhere to go. He stood slowly, thinking for a moment, then nodded toward the ranch. "You can stay here tonight," he said. "It's not much, but it's warm. And there's food." The girl studied him carefully, as if measuring his words, weighing trust against instinct. Finally, she stepped forward. Just one step. But it was enough. Daniel turned and led the way, walking slower than usual so she could follow. When they reached the cabin, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The warmth from the fire filled the space immediately. He moved aside, letting her enter first. She paused at the doorway, her eyes scanning everything: the table, the stove, the bed, the small shelf of supplies. She noticed everything. "You can sit," Daniel said, gesturing to the chair. She didn't sit. Instead, she stood near the wall, her back straight, her posture alert. Daniel nodded slightly. He understood. He moved to the stove and began preparing something simple: beans, bread, water. He worked quietly, not wanting to overwhelm her. When he placed the food on the table, he stepped back. "Eat," he said. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. Hunger overcame caution. She ate quickly but not carelessly, like someone used to making every bite count. Daniel watched in silence. After a while, he spoke again. "You got a name?" She swallowed, then looked up. "A pony," she said. Daniel nodded. "I'm Daniel." Another pause. Then she added quietly, "I am Apache." He met her gaze. "All right," he said simply. There was no judgment in his voice, no surprise, just acceptance. Something in her shoulders relaxed, just a little. That night, Daniel gave her a blanket and a place near the fire. He didn't ask more questions. He didn't need to. As the wind whispered outside and the fire crackled softly inside, the cabin felt different, not as empty, not as cold. Days turned into a quiet routine. Apache stayed. She helped where she could, gathering wood, carrying water, watching the cattle with a focus far beyond her years. She didn't speak much, but when she did, her words mattered. Daniel found himself adjusting to her presence in ways he hadn't expected. He spoke more. He listened more. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was steady. One morning, as they walked along the edge of the property, Apache suddenly stopped. "Tracks," she said softly. Daniel looked down. Hoof prints. Fresh. He frowned. "Travelers?" he muttered. But Apache shook her head. "Not just travelers," she said. Her eyes scanned the horizon, sharp and alert. "They are looking." Daniel felt a tension settle in his chest. "Looking for what?" he asked. Apache didn't answer immediately. She just looked out across the land, her expression unreadable. Then she said quietly, "Maybe for me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with something unspoken. Daniel followed her gaze, his instincts sharpening. He had taken her in without question. But now it seemed her past wasn't as distant as he thought, and whatever was coming wasn't far behind. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a figure appeared in the distance, riding fast, straight toward the ranch. Daniel stepped onto the porch, his hand resting near his side, his posture tense. Apache stood behind him, silent but still. The rider came closer, a woman, her posture strong, her presence commanding. When she finally stopped in front of the cabin, her eyes locked onto Apache instantly, not with fear, but with something deeper, relief, and something else. Daniel glanced back at the girl, then at the woman on the horse. He didn't know who she was, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a reunion. This was the beginning of a truth he had never expected, and it was about to change everything. The woman didn't dismount immediately. She sat tall on her horse, her sharp eyes fixed on the girl behind Daniel, as if the world around them had ceased to exist. For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind moved softly across the land, carrying tension with it like a warning. Then slowly the woman slid down from the saddle. Her boots touched the ground with quiet strength. Apache stepped forward, just slightly, her breath catching in her chest. "Mother," she whispered. The word was soft, almost fragile, but it carried across the silence like thunder. Daniel's gaze shifted between them, understanding settling in pieces. The woman stepped closer, her expression softening in a way that revealed everything she had been holding back. She knelt down, her hands gently reaching for Apache's shoulders, as if afraid she might disappear. "Apache," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I searched everywhere." Apache didn't hesitate this time. She moved forward, wrapping her arms tightly around her mother, holding on as if she would never let go. Daniel looked away for a moment, giving them space, but something in his chest tightened. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to feel loss again. After a while, the woman stood, her hand resting protectively on Apache's shoulder. She turned her gaze to Daniel, her expression now serious, measured. "You took her in," she said. He nodded. "She needed a place." The woman studied him carefully, as if weighing his character in silence. "You kept her safe," she added. Daniel shrugged slightly. Anyone would have done the same. She shook her head gently. "No," she said, "not everyone would." There was a pause. Then she stepped closer, her voice lowering. "You should know the truth." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "What truth?" he asked. Apache looked up at her mother, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face, but the woman gave her a reassuring glance before speaking. "My name is Nita," she said, "and my daughter is not just any child." Daniel felt a quiet tension settle in his chest again. "Go on," he said. Nita took a slow breath. "There are men searching for her. Not to help, not to protect. Her gaze hardened. But to use her. Daniel's expression darkened. Use her for what? Apache's grip tightened on her mother's hand. Nita answered carefully, because of who her father was. The words hung in the air, heavy and unfinished. Daniel's mind raced. He had sensed there was more to the story, but not this. Her father was a leader, Nita continued quietly, respected, strong, but he made enemies, powerful ones. Daniel crossed his arms. And they think the child matters? Nita nodded. In our people, blood carries more than name. It carries right and claim. Daniel let out a slow breath, understanding dawning. So they're hunting her. Yes. The answer was simple, but it carried danger. Daniel glanced at Apache. She stood still, but her eyes revealed everything. Fear, strength, and something else, trust. He looked back at Nita. Then why come here, he asked. Why not keep running? Nita met his gaze directly. Because she ran here, she said softly, and that means something. Daniel frowned slightly. Means what? Nita hesitated, then said, it means she trusted you before she even knew you. Silence followed. Daniel wasn't a man who believed in fate, but something about that felt real. He looked down at the ground, then back at Apache. You didn't tell me all this, he said gently. She shook her head. I didn't know if I should. Daniel nodded slowly. You did what you had to. He turned back to Nita. So what happens now? Nita's expression grew serious again. Now, they will come, she said, if they haven't already. As if summoned by her words, a distant sound echoed across the land. Horses. More than one. Daniel's head snapped toward the horizon. Dark figures moved against the fading light, riding fast. Inside, he said immediately, his voice firm. Apache looked at him, hesitation in her eyes. Go, he said, repeated. She nodded and hurried into the cabin. Nita didn't move. You don't have to do this, she said quietly. Daniel grabbed his rifle, checking it quickly. Yeah, he replied. I do. He stepped forward, positioning himself between the approaching riders in the cabin. The figures grew clearer, 3 men, armed, determined. The kind of men who didn't ask questions first. The kind who took what they came for. Daniel stood his ground, his posture steady, his eyes cold. When the riders finally stopped, one of them spoke. We're looking for the girl. Daniel didn't move. You're not finding her here. The man smirked slightly. That's so? Daniel lifted the rifle just enough to make his point clear. That's so. A tense silence followed. The wind carried dust between them. Then slowly the riders exchanged glances. They had expected an easy claim. Not resistance. Not a man willing to stand in their way. Finally, the lead rider gave a small nod. This isn't over, he said. Daniel's voice didn't waver. It is here. The men lingered for a moment longer before turning their horses and riding off into the distance. But the threat didn't leave with them. It lingered, heavy in the air. Daniel lowered the rifle slowly, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. Nita stepped beside him. You just made yourself part of this, she said quietly. Daniel nodded. I figured that. He glanced back toward the cabin where Apache waited inside. Then he said something he hadn't planned, something that came from a place he thought had long been empty. She's not going anywhere, he said. Nita studied him carefully, then gave a slow nod of respect. For the first time, there was trust in her eyes. The kind that isn't given easily, the kind that's earned. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the ranch in deep shadows. But inside that fading light, something had changed. Daniel had taken the girl in out of simple kindness, but now she was family. And whatever came next, whatever danger followed, he would face it not alone, but with something he hadn't felt in years. A purpose. And as the night settled over the land, quiet and watchful, One truth became clear. This wasn't the end of their story. It was only the beginning.